300 feet above Washington, D.C., a man pressed his palm flat against the marble and felt the most famous structure in America hum. It shouldn't have done that. Stone doesn't hum. The 400,000 tons of granite and marble stacked into a single obelisk, piercing the sky over the Capitol, should have been silent. Dead weight, permanence itself. That was the entire point of it, but under his hand the wall vibrated. A low, hollow resonance. The sound a drum makes when you strike it from the inside. The Washington Monument, the tallest stone structure on Earth, the spine of the American Capitol, the shape every schoolchild could draw from memory, was ringing, because it was empty, not solid, not the seamless tower of the postcards. Behind that famous white skin was a patchwork of air pockets, loose rubble, water leaking through the joints, and objects that had been sealed inside for half a century and never once looked at. It was 1934. The men sent up the scaffold to fix the monument were about to become the first people in 50 years to learn what was actually inside it. And what they found was not a secret. It was something stranger. It was the truth about how the monument, and the country that built it, had actually been made. No one had looked closely at the Washington Monument since the day it was finished. It was completed in 1884 and opened to the public in 1888. And then for nearly 50 years, it simply stood there, admired, photographed, climbed by tourists, and otherwise ignored by the people responsible for keeping it standing. No repairs, no close inspection, no one running a hand along the joints to ask whether the most important monument in the country was actually sound. By the early 1930s, it clearly was not. The exterior had cracked, marble had spalled and flaked, mortar was leaching out through the walls in pale streaks, and water was finding its way inside. So, in 1934, with funding from a Public Works Administration grant, a full restoration finally began. A tubular steel scaffold was raised around the entire shaft, wrapping the obelisk like a cage, and for the first time since the masons left, men were lifted to within arm's reach of every inch of stone. 555 feet of it, rising in a single unbroken taper from the lawn to the sky. The exterior cracks were the part everyone could see. They were not the part that mattered. A building stone specialist named Daniel Kessler, sent from the Federal Bureau of Standards, the agency we now call NIST, examined the structure and reported something the public was never meant to dwell on. The weight of the monument had been distributed badly. Deep in the lower walls, where the load was heaviest, there were hollow spaces and cracks running through the masonry. The walls were not what they looked like. The outer layer was marble. An inner layer was gneiss. And between them, in that critical lower section, the original builders had not used precision-cut stone at all. They had packed the gap with irregular nice rubble, loose, mismatched fragments, poured in to save money by men who were perpetually, desperately short of it. That was the answer to the hum. The wall rang because, in places, it was barely a wall. And it raised a question that the renovation could repair the stone, but never quite repair. Why was America's most sacred monument built on a foundation of shortcuts and compromises, and things hidden from view? And who had decided the public didn't need to know? To understand what they poured into those hollow walls in 1934, you first have to understand what had been buried inside them from the very beginning. On July 4, 1848, a man stood at the bottom of a foundation pit wearing George Washington's apron. Not a replica, the actual leather Masonic apron that Washington himself had worn 55 years earlier when he laid the cornerstone of the United States Capitol. The man wearing it was Benjamin Brown French, Grand Master of the Freemasons of Washington, and in his hand he held Washington's own gavel. He was about to seal something into the earth that, by design, no living person was ever meant to retrieve. The crowd was enormous. 20,000 people. President James K. Polk presided. In the audience were 3 future presidents, a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln among them, alongside James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson. And standing near the front were 2 women who were living bridges to the founding of the country itself. Dolly Madison, widow of James Madison, and Elizabeth Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, then 90 years old. What they came to witness was the burial of a time capsule. The cornerstone was a single block of marble weighing 24,500 pounds. Set into it was a zinc case, sealed over with a copper plate, and inside that case, the Washington National Monument Society had placed 73 items. A Bible, copies of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, a portrait of George Washington, a set of coins, speeches, books, government documents, the records of Masonic and benevolent societies, and 71 newspapers gathered from across the entire country, a paper snapshot of a young, restless, expanding nation, meant to be read by Americans of some unimaginable future. Using Washington's gavel, his square and his level, the same tools, the same rituals as the Capitol 55 years before, they sealed it shut. And then, slowly, the country lost it. When the monument's foundation was discovered to be inadequate and had to be massively reinforced between 1879 and 1880, the ground level around it was raised by roughly 17 feet. The cornerstone, with its sealed zinc case, was buried far deeper than it had ever been meant to be. No record was kept of whether it was moved, protected, or simply entombed where it lay. Today, the best estimate places it around 21 feet below the current pavement, near the northeast corner of the shaft, wedged between a concrete slab and a concrete buttress. No one has opened it. No one has seen its contents since the afternoon of July 4th, 1848. And here is the detail the official histories tend to glide past. In 1934, the workers pouring cement into the hollow walls above knew that somewhere beneath them, in a foundation they could not reach, sat a sealed vault no one had touched in 86 years. By the time they were finished, they had added their own layer of concrete and cement to the structure, burying whatever was down there a little deeper still. But the cornerstone was not the only thing cemented into the Washington Monument. Its walls held nearly 200 more objects, and one of them had been the center of a crime so violent that it nearly destroyed the monument entirely. Just after midnight on March the 6th, 1854, 9 men gathered in the darkness at the base of the unfinished monument. They had already poisoned the watchdog. Now they overpowered the night watchman, tied him, and broke into the storage shed. The workers called the lapidarium, the place where commemorative stones waited their turn to be set into the interior walls. They were there for one stone in particular, and they meant to make it disappear. To understand why, you have to understand the stones themselves. From the beginning, the society had invited states, cities, organizations, and foreign nations to donate blocks of stone for the monument's interior walls. Each one a gift, a tribute, a small piece of somewhere else made permanent inside the tribute to Washington. 193 of those stones are embedded in the monument today. You can see them on the long elevator descent from the observation deck. Stones from Brazil, Japan, Greece, Wales, from Chinese laborers in San Francisco, from American states and cities, and 22 separate Masonic lodges. Some hold rare materials: jade from Alaska, petrified wood from Arizona, coral and sandstone from Hawaii, sealed into the stone forever. The stone the 9 men came for had been a gift from Pope Pius IX. It was a block of marble taken from the ancient Temple of Concord in Rome, a structure that dated to 366 BC, and it carried a simple inscription: Rome to America. To the men in the dark, that was intolerable. They belonged to the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant movement known as the Know-Nothings, and the idea of a papal gift inside America's monument was an offence they had decided to erase. They carried the Pope's stone to a boat on the tidal basin and dumped it into the Potomac River. A confession given nearly 30 years later described how the men broke off chunks to keep as souvenirs before the rest sank into the water. It was never recovered, but the theft did far more damage than the loss of a single stone. In its chaotic aftermath, the Know-Nothing movement seized control of the Washington National Monument Society itself. Under their brief, bitter custody, the work nearly collapsed. They managed to add only about 26 feet of new marble, and they used stone that the original master mason had already rejected as inferior. That flawed marble is still there. If you look at the monument from the outside, roughly a third of the way up, you can see a clear change in color, a band where the white shifts to a slightly different shade at around the 150-foot mark. Most people assume it's just weathering, or 2 batches of stone that aged differently. It isn't. That seam is the scar left by the theft of the Pope's stone. It marks the height the monument had reached when the country's hatreds stopped it cold, and the years it sat, abandoned before the Army Corps of Engineers finally took over and finished it. When the 1934 crews reached that band on their scaffold, they were looking at a historical crime scene in stone, and they cleaned and inspected all 193 commemorative stones for the first time in 50 years, finding cracked mortar around several of them, and in some cases, water that had reached the stones themselves. Left unchecked, the slow seep would have quietly rotted the monument's memory from inside, one stone at a time. But the strangest discovery of the entire renovation was waiting 555 feet up, at the very tip. At the summit of the Washington Monument sits a small pyramid of cast aluminum, and in 1934, a crew climbed to it, unbolted the band that had covered it for half a century, and found that nature had been quietly destroying it. When the monument was completed in 1884, that aluminum apex was a marvel in its own right. It was cast by William Frishmuth of Philadelphia, and at the time it was the largest single piece of aluminum ever produced. Aluminum then was not the cheap metal of soda cans. It was a precious metal, rivaling silver in price, and the tip was treated like a jewel. Before it was installed, it was put on display at Tiffany's in New York, where visitors lined up to step over it, so they could say for the rest of their lives that they had stepped over the top of the Washington Monument before it was ever raised above the city. From 1885 onward, that apex was wrapped in a wide gold-plated copper band, carrying 8 lightning rods, meant to protect the summit from strikes. For 49 years it stayed bolted in place, hiding most of the apex and its inscriptions from view. In 1934, the crew removed it. What they found underneath was a casualty. Decades of lightning strikes had blasted the very tip of the aluminum away. Roughly 3/8 of an inch of the point had simply been vaporized into the sky. Fused globules of aluminum clung to the sides of the pyramid where the heat of the strikes had melted and re-solidified the metal. The crews pried several of these globules off and sent them away for microscopic and chemical study. The analysis that followed read the metal like a fingerprint. The apex was found to be about 98% pure aluminum, with faint traces of iron, silicon, manganese, copper, tin, and sodium. A document of 1880s industry, written in metal at the top of the country. The lightning had done worse than blunt the tip. One marble block near the top of the pyramidion had been struck so severely that it could not be saved. It was cut out and replaced with a fresh slab weighing 1,200 pounds, a piece of major surgery on the monument summit that almost no member of the public has ever heard about. And on the apex's east face, the workers could finally read the inscriptions the copper band had hidden for half a century. Among them, carved there by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1884 and invisible to every visitor since, were two Latin words, Laus Deo, praise be to God. They had sat at the very peak of the United States for 50 years, struck by lightning, read by no one. The 1934 crew added 2 words of their own to the metal, recording the repair, the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, the only addition to the apex since the day it was set in place. Standing at 555 feet, fused aluminum in their hands, those men had become the only people alive who knew exactly how damaged the monument really was. Hollow rubble in the lower walls, a lost cornerstone in the foundation, a century of lightning eating the summit. And below them, the city going about its day, entirely unaware. What they did with all of it, what they poured in, sealed over, and inscribed before quietly handing the monument back, is the real story. The repair itself was almost absurdly simple. At the 150-foot landing, the workers drilled holes into the walls and poured liquid cement into them, letting gravity carry it down through the hollow rubble. Fill to the base, filling the empty spaces that had been there since 1849. The plugged holes are still visible on that landing today, if you know to look for them. That cement did exactly what Daniel Kessler had prescribed. It filled the voids and redistributed the monument's enormous weight. But it did something else too, something no one set out to do. It permanently entombed whatever was already inside those walls, burying the monument's secrets a final time in the name of saving it. The full cost of the renovation was $86,375. And here is the detail that says everything. The scaffolding alone cost $67,000 of that. Nearly 4 times the price of the actual repairs went simply to building the structure that let men reach the monument at all. Restoring it was cheap. Getting to it was the expensive part. They repointed something like 48,000 linear feet of mortar, enough to stretch most of the way from Washington to Baltimore. They reinscribed the apex, replaced the lightning protection, swapped in 1,200 pounds of new marble, filled the hollow walls, and scrubbed the entire exterior clean for the first time in 50 years. Then the scaffold came down, and the monument looked exactly as it always had. The public was told, in effect, that the monument had been cleaned and made sound. What it was not told was that the cornerstone is lost, that the Bible, the Constitution, the 71 newspapers, and Washington's portrait are still sealed in a zinc case somewhere between 17 and 21 feet beneath the pavement at the northeast corner, and that no one has ever conducted an official excavation to find them. No one has seen them since 1848. So here is the truth the 1934 workers actually uncovered. They did not find a secret inside the Washington Monument. They found something more specific and more uncomfortable. They found the accumulated consequence of building a national monument under financial pressure, political violence, and ideological hatred, and the constant temptation to patch over the cracks rather than expose them. Every hollow space in those walls matched a compromise. Every shortcut corresponded to men who needed the monument to exist more than they needed it to be perfect. What they cemented in was not a conspiracy. It was a mirror. The monument still stands. The plugged holes are still there on the 150-foot landing. The lost cornerstone is still down in the dark beneath the northeast corner, with its zinc case and its 73 objects, surrounded by concrete poured in 1879 and cement poured in 1934. The apex still carries the inscription of the men who climbed up and found fused metal where a perfect point used to be. And somewhere in the walls, cemented in for 170 years, are 193 stones from places and nations that no longer exist in the same form, including the empty space where a gift from ancient Rome once was, until 9 men in the dark decided some things should not be allowed inside America's monument to itself. They were wrong about that. But the cement they poured, the real cement and the metaphorical kind, has held. What they found inside the Washington Monument in 1934 wasn't a secret. It was the country, cemented in.